Well, hello and good afternoon, friends and members of St. Martin Lutheran Church. This is Pastor Jim. Today is Wednesday. It is January the 6th, a big day in our country. We had a big election last night, and as has been the case, uh, it's close. It's almost it's looking like both of the Democratic senators are ahead in the counting, but of course uh, I don't know. I don't pretend to understand it all. We'll see how this all plays out. But thank you for joining us today. If you're joining us live or perhaps maybe watching this later today, our topic is kind of a continuation of yesterday's discussion on Matthew chapter 2, which is the story of the visit of the wise men. And as always, I have misplaced my Bible, so if you hold on one sec. You'd think the pastor would remember to bring his Bible to a Bible study, right? That would be, you'd think one of the first things you look for in calling a pastor to your church is that he brings his Bible to the Bible study. Well, something I'll work on. It's going to be a continuation. We're going to take a closer look at our gospel, which is Matthew 2, 1 to 12, which is the visit of the Magi or the wise men from the east to the baby Jesus. But a couple things to note before we begin. My guess is you've probably heard, if you live in or around Birch Run or have, that last night Heather and Gerald Brown's house burnt down, burnt to the ground. Not a thing left. The family is okay. Gerald is in the hospital. He's recovering. The family's immediate needs are being taken care of right now, but in the upcoming days and weeks and months, not only just to the church but other people as well, we're going to be organizing, collection of things, and we'll be getting out kind of some of the specific things the family needs, and as well as if you're on Facebook, you probably have seen all of the things going on. But our prayers for them, for Heather and Gerald and Briere and Cheyenne, and for all the family who is affected by this. And as I mentioned, keep an eye out in the upcoming days. We'll have some specific ways in which you will be able to help out. So we will let you know. So our reading from Matthew chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, it begins after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That, Matthew's gospel actually tells us very little about the birth of Jesus. We get most of the details of the birth story from Luke. But what Matthew does tell us is what happened after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, as you know, was the ancestral home of David, the great king of Israel, and really founder of the royal dynasty that was in Israel. However, Bethlehem in and of itself was not a very large or significant town. about 6 miles to the south of Jerusalem. In the old days, it was called Ephrath or Ephratah, meaning fruitful. And this was the place where Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin in Genesis chapter 35. And it continues in the days of Herod the king. Herod, Herod, Herod. We hear all about the Herods. This one was Herod the Great. And now, in some ways, he was great. He was a gifted builder. He was a gifted administrator, a gifted politician. But he was also quite gifted in cruelty, and some even said insanity and paranoia. He was loyal, an excellent administrator. He was able to keep his power under different and successive Roman emperors, which says something. But this, speaking of the character of Herod the Great, this is what Caesar Augustus wrote about Herod. He wrote this. He said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. And what you find is Herod killed 3 of his sons. He killed 2 of his brothers-in-law. Any threat to his rule, he would kill. And so we'll get back to Herod in just a bit in the reading. And what we read is wise men from the east came. These are in Greek, it's magi, or magi. Now, some call them kings, wise men, magi. They were probably astronomers, respected people in their communities. We always think there's 3, right? But there could have and probably were more, but 3 because of 3 gifts, as well as one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, had said he thought that was 3. But think about this. Now, they were from the east, the far east, at least a year's journey on foot to Jerusalem. Now, they would have been amongst exiled Jews over the centuries. So they would have had at least a knowledge of Judaism and a knowledge of the Messiah in that. And that these knowing, for the Jews, there was always the promise of the Messiah, that a king would come. So these non-Jews from the east are understanding that this king is born in Bethlehem. And there was this sort of general expectation for many parts of the world that the Messiah would come from Judea, not just from Jerusalem, but from other parts of the world, again, because many people believed in the diaspora where the Jewish people were scattered across the world. They would have shared that as well. Church tradition, and this comes from the Eastern Church, that even names the 3 wise men, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar. And a tradition holds that Emperor Constantine's wife found their skulls in India, that the 3 wise men, after visiting Jesus, they went to India and founded a church and died there. And actually, you can see the supposed skulls of the 3 wise men in the great cathedral in Cologne, Germany. And I'm not kidding about that. So they came to Jerusalem. They were guided by an astronomical phenomenon, and the star led them. And just like the pillar of fire and cloud guided the Israelites, this phenomenon guided the wise men. And because think about it, they're traveling day and night, so you don't normally see stars during the day. So did they see a fire during the day? We don't know all the details, but this star guided them. And it's interesting, and I read this is an interesting comment, that the shepherds didn't miss. When the angels came to the shepherds, they went right to Jesus. For the wise men, the star led them, but they first went to the leaders of Israel, right? And to Herod. And they kind of missed the mark a little bit. But they come to Herod, and they ask him, where is he born King of the Jews? They had traveled a great distance to honor a king, and yet there's a little irony in here about them wanting to honor the king of the Jews. At this time, Jewish people across the world were, for the most part, despised. They were dishonored. They didn't have control over their own country. Many people throughout the world disliked them because of their success and their seeming prosperity. So across the world, the Jewish people were not revered. So it's interesting that these Eastern magi or wise men would be so interested in seeing a king of the Jews, to honor, and then not only to honor a king of the Jews, but to honor an infant king. And, because normally people aren't born kings. Jesus's kingly status wasn't conferred on him later, but at his birth. Normally people are born and then they become princes and then king, but yet Christ was inaugurated king at his birth. And they say, you know what? We saw his star in the east. And interesting, when you read in it, it's his star. It's Christ's star, that the star was Christ's itself. And it led others to Christ. And it did this because it moved in the right direction. And one person wrote, sort of lamenting the fact that leaders or preachers in the church, maybe they do a good job of pointing people to Christ, but then they don't follow him. That the wise men not only followed the star, but they followed it to Christ. They didn't go their own way. And they say, we've come to worship him. Now, there's no reason, and it's interesting, among some liberal theologians, they try to explain this away, and, well, they didn't really mean worship, and no, they were there. Now, we can say they didn't truly, it's possible they didn't truly understand precisely who they were worshiping, but they were there to worship, make no mistake. And in verse 3, we read that Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And that makes sense. As I mentioned, Herod was not a Jew. He was an Edomite, established as a king over Jerusalem. And, and there's history shows us that no sooner had Herod come to the throne when he annihilated 300 court officers of the Sanhedrin. He murdered his own wife, Mariamne, and her mother, Alexandria. He killed his eldest son, Antipater, as well as two other sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. So it makes sense that if he's troubled, the people are going to be troubled because they know of his murderous rages. And as we know at the conclusion of this story, when Joseph is told to flee to Egypt, we know Herod's response in trying to snuff out this king. Just kind of a testimony to the greatness of Christ, even as a baby, that this now born king shakes the powers of the earth with his birth. And then Herod gathers all the chief priests and the scribes, and he wants some information about what's going on. So chief priests would include all those who once held the office and who were in the office of high priest. And apparently history shows that Herod would change the high priest often, using it for political leverage, apparently. And the scribes, when I think of scribe, right, I think of someone sitting down and copying things. Scribes weren't copiers of manuscripts. They were teachers of the Old Testament. And he says to them, what is this? Where is the Christ or the Messiah to be born? And they quote from him rightly from Micah chapter 5, verse 2, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." And Bethlehem in Judah, to differentiate it from, there was another Bethlehem in the north, so it was Bethlehem from Judah. And from this passage, they understood that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and that he would be a ruler for the people Israel. But of course, they didn't follow up on it. They knew the information, but they didn't move forward. They were sort of indifferent to it, probably thinking, well, this can't be the case. And then Herod calls the wise men to him, and he wants to know precisely when they saw the star, right? Precisely when, which makes sense because as we read later, it's 2 years and younger. He has the young males killed throughout Jerusalem. And then he tells them, go and search for the child. And when you find him, go ahead and tell me, because I want to go and worship him too. Of course, they didn't do that. Thankfully, there was a divine intervention, if you will. And they after they met with the Christ child, they went on their own way. And then we come to the last 3 verses, and this is the gifts of the Magi. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's from the Eastern church that we get the tradition that there were three kings or three wise men and the names of the wise men. And it's also from the Western church we get this notion that the gifts presented to the Christ child had significant, represented significant things of the nature of Christ himself. Gold and frankincense and myrrh. Gold being a gift for a king, right, for royalty. Frankincense grew in Ethiopia in the Arabian Peninsula. The frankincense trees were apparently so revered that tradition held that winged angels protected them and that only people of pure spirits could even approach these trees. Jews would have used frankincense to burn on the altar when they made sacrifices. So, in a sense, we have gold for a king, frankincense for a priest, and then myrrh. Now, myrrh was, all of these gifts were very expensive, so these were not things that a normal person would be having around the house. Myrrh in Hebrew is also mar or mara for bitter. And the Egyptians would use myrrh for embalming bodies. And so, the early church, as early as the 3rd century, understood sort of the significance of these specific gifts. And so it would seem odd. It seems odd to me, right? The gold makes sense. The frankincense makes sense. But to give a baby what amounts to an embalming agent, a gift that is used for the purpose of death. And it would sort of be like, I guess, today, you have a friend whose baby is born, and you say, hey, I got him a gift. I got them a full funeral package at Ogwyn Funeral Home. Burial plot and casket and the like. You would get some strange looks. I mean, it's a nice gift, and inexpensive, right? But not a gift you give to a baby. Except, of course, you and I on the other side of the story, if you will, understand that the purpose of this baby was to be born, to live, and to die for you. So the myrrh makes sense. The myrrh makes sense. And we don't know if the wise men themselves understood the significance of these gifts or what they represented. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But what happens? They fall down and they worship him. And, in this story, we see three different responses to Jesus. Three different responses we see in our world today. That all people respond in one of these three ways. Herod displayed what I see often in at least mainstream secular world, and that is open hatred and hostility towards Jesus. That's one. The chief priests and the scribes were indifferent, all the while sort of retaining their religious respectability and their religious knowledge. They just couldn't be bothered. And then the wise men who sought Jesus out and worshiped him at great cost. And what we see here is the beginning of this pattern that's going to be repeated throughout the New Testament. And that is, those who look for Jesus will see him, and those who truly see him will worship him. And as well, it's to be noted that Jesus comes for the Jew first and then the Gentile. He comes from the poor and then the rich. He comes from the ignorant and then to the wise. That should tell us something. As St. Paul would later write. Paul was great at kind of bragging about his accomplishments, but he did it for a reason. He was kind of setting his audience up. He'd say, I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees, born of the tribe of Benjamin, a very prominent, as we talk today, being from the tribe of Benjamin was a thing to be revered. I was the smartest guy in Pharisee class. I was circumcised on the 8th day. All these accomplishments, and then he says, and all of that I consider rubbish, skubalon in the Greek, rubbish compared to knowing Christ and his resurrection. So, there we have it, the story of the wise men. Today is Epiphany, we celebrate Epiphany, and this is what we'll be celebrating on Sunday, the beginning of the season of Epiphany. And so, we don't have a whole lot of Epiphany hymns, but one of the good ones is As With Gladness Men of Old, written by William Dix, written in the middle part of the 18th century. Most English hymn writers in the 18th and 17th century were pastors. William Dix was not a pastor. He was an accountant. but wrote many different hymns that are very notable. A lot of Christmas hymns as well, and this is just a good, as with gladness men of old, just a good recounting of the story of the three wise men. As with gladness men of old did the guiding star behold, as with joy they hailed its light, leading onward beaming bright, so most gracious Lord may we evermore be led by thee. As with joyful steps they sped, Saviour, to thy lowly bed, there to bend the knee before thee whom heaven and earth adore. So may we with willing feet ever seek thy mercy seat. As they offered gifts most rare at thy cradle rude and bare, so may we with holy joy, pure and free from sin's alloy, all our costliest treasures bring, Christ to thee, our heavenly King. Holy Jesus, every day keep us in the narrow way, and when earthly things are past, bring our ransomed souls at last, where they need no star to guide, where no clouds thy glory hide. In the heavenly country bright, need they no created light. Thou its light, its joy, its crown, thou its sun which goes not down. Therefore ever may we sing Alleluias to our King. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Continued prayers for the Brown family, for the family of Fred and Beryl Eyrer, who we buried yesterday, and for our country, for peace and unity, wherever you stand on the political side. Scripture tells us to pray for our leaders and our leaders elect, so that it will go peaceably for us and that we can live in a stable and a safe world. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Receive the Lord's blessing. Be a blessing to others. I love you guys. I invite you to join us tonight for worship at 6 o'clock, online and in person. May God bless the rest of your day.